Well, I guess first thing first, I mean, I know you're an old surf guitarist and songwriter, and I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on the passing of Brian Wilson, which kind of everybody I know is thinking about at least a little bit.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I'm a huge Beach Boys fan. I always have been, unashamedly.
Yeah.
And as a guitar player, I can only say that, man, we've all listened to those Beach Boys songs a million times. But when you actually sit down and start figuring out some of those arrangements and those guitar parts, that's when it really hits you. Like, oh wow, this guy was on just a whole nother level.
Right.
Just incredibly difficult stuff. And it's just on another level. I went and saw the guy when he sort of came out of retirement and was doing these shows where he was doing like the entirety of Pet Sounds. And this is, close to 25 years ago. And, it's kind of hard to describe just how stuff hits you, but they started playing Wouldn't It Be Nice, and it was like, man, about 60 seconds in, I was just crying my eyes out.
I know.
And
yeah.
It was just unbelievable to see, that guy with that band, performing all those songs. So he's right up at the top in my book, and I guess it's sad to lose him. On the other hand, I remember when that guy was 400 pounds back in the 70s,
right.
and they thought he was going to die, and there was rumors that he hadn't gotten out of bed in 3 years or something like that.
Right.
So it's kind of amazing that he had this incredible second act and got to live to be 82 years old.
It's interesting you mentioned his guitar arrangements, because we all kind of think about vocals first when it comes to the Beach Boys, but the guitar arrangements and how he composed songs are equally, difficult and interesting, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And, the vocal harmonies are a whole nother thing.
Right.
I've tried to figure out how to do that style of vocal harmonizing that he got from the Four Freshmen, and that's incredibly difficult too. So there's so much going on those records.
Yep. Well, if I could take you back in time a little bit for your own personal history, you grew up in Columbia, Missouri, right? Even though you've lived in LA for a long time.
Yep.
By your late teens, you're in a kick-ass band, the Untaped Youth, and you're already a really talented player. And I'm just kind of wondering, how did you get initially hooked? What got you at such a young age to where this was just your thing?
Well, Columbia, Missouri, even though it doesn't sound like much to the average person, it was actually a really amazing place to grow up just in terms of music, because it was a college town. And so, even back then when I was a kid, which is a long time ago, they had this circuit that, bands, and not just bands, I'm talking about old blues guys and college rock alternative bands and other types of performing artists. They all kind of would do this circuit where they would play in Chicago, and then they'd come down to St. Louis and Kansas City, and they would hit Columbia in the middle of all that because it was a college town, you know, and so they could draw a crowd and make some money, and then they would go on and play Lincoln and Omaha, Nebraska, and maybe go down to Tulsa or something like that. But it was part of this old kind of Chitlin circuit that all these blues guys had been doing, since the 50s. And when I was growing up, it was just so much live music coming through there. It was unbelievable. And when I first got into music, all of a sudden it was like, I really like this old blues music that I discovered, and Willie Dixon is playing at the local club this week. He was the first guy I ever went to see. And so, for a 13-year-old kid to just walk in and see this, legendary blues guy on stage, it was really eye-opening to me. And I remember just that the first couple of years that I went out to see music, my dad would talk to the bar owner or whatever and say, look, my son's not going to drink. He just wants to see the music. And somehow or another, they allowed it.
Right.
And so, I saw people like Bill Monroe and John Lee Hooker and the Paladins. I remember seeing the Paladins. And it was just a real mind-blowing experience. And so, of course, I wanted in on that. And I started playing guitar in bars when I was 13 years old, and just kind of have been doing it ever since. And I guess I'm probably the last generation of people who actually got into it because I was poor and, felt I could make money doing it.
Right.
Now it's playing music is something you can only do if you have a trust fund or something. But I got into it because, and this is 100 years ago. I was 16 years old and I was making $50 a gig and playing 3 or 4 nights a week. And
Wow.
I go back to that now. I'm like, man, adjusted for inflation, I was making way more money back then.
Your dad must have been supportive then if he was, kind of turning you loose.
Yeah, both my parents were. And, my mom always wished that I had gotten a real job. And, of course, she was right. But, my dad was a guy that he worked as a pencil pusher in an office for the Army, and he hated it.
Mm-hmm.
So he quit that job, and he started restoring antique airplanes in a barn behind our house.
Mm.
So, he was kind of a free spirit and a guy who figured out his own path, and I guess that rubbed off on me.
Right. So by the time, the late 80s, early 90s, you're putting out regular LPs with the Untamed Youth. And if you think back on it and you think about your first real tour, like where you're gone, for more than a couple of days, maybe it was a couple of weeks or a month or something, like what comes to mind when you think about your early touring days?
Well, I told you about a lot of the blues and country and rock and roll bands that I saw, but at that same time, there was all these punk bands touring, and we used to go see them as well. And, I remember seeing Black Flag and Toxic Reasons and the Circle Jerks and all these kind of bands. And they were just people who would load themselves up in a van and go around and play these club shows. And we saw that happening, and we said, there's no reason that we can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we bought a 1968 Oldsmobile hearse, and we just started touring around the country and driving ourselves everywhere. And more often than not, we're just sleeping on somebody's hardwood floors, and maybe we're buying cans of SpaghettiOs and splitting those. But we did it. I mean, that was what we wanted to do, and so we figured out how we were going to do it. And I think back to those early touring days, I'm like, man, that is rough. I don't know if I'd really want to sleep on hardwood floors and witness some of the horrors that I witnessed back in those days.
Right,
but,
right.
But, when you're 18, 19 years old, man, it's pretty fun.
Yeah, it can still roll off of you, 2-3 weeks of bad sleep.
Yeah.
So, you roll through the 90s with the Untamed Youth, and that leads you into Echophonics and other groups. But, like, if you follow the footsteps of your recording history, it seems like you were already guesting with other bands and projects. And, I mean, at what point were you like, hey, I can be kind of a legit session guy and people want me to play on their records? Like, when did you really start kind of chasing that a little bit?
Well, I moved from Missouri out to California when I was 23 years old in 1991. And, that was sort of during the time period where there was a whole lot of home studios with like, Tascam Porta studios and things like that. But it wasn't really until I saw Wally Hersom, who was the bass player from Big Sandy and the Flyride Boys. He had built this vintage style recording studio in his grandma's garage up in the Anaheim Hills, and we recorded there, and it blew my mind because it had never really occurred to me that the reason why these old records sound the way they do is because they were using certain pieces of equipment and doing it all live basically. And so beginning when I was 25, 26 years old, I started doing a bunch of sessions at Wally's place, and then I started buying my own recording equipment. And by the end of the 1990s, I had my own studio, which I still have going on, which is currently sort of a mixture of the best stuff from the old days and the best stuff from the new days. I do have a computer set up, and we don't do everything live anymore, but still have lots of vintage microphones and vintage microphone preamps and outboard gear and reel-to-reel tape recorders and things like that. So for me, it's just always something that captivated my interest, and I just always tried to do it as much as I possibly could. So yeah, if you look on Discogs or any of those things, you'll see a ton of things that I've done over the years, just guesting on other people's records or recording at my studio.
Right. I mean, I remember the first time I saw you play live, which was at Burger Boogaloo, now Mosswood Meltdown in Oakland in 2015. And I was standing like way up front to the stage, and you guys opened with Ellie Mae, and I didn't know the song at the time, and I was watching your playing style. I was pretty captivated by it because you've got big hands, but you play deftly, you know. And I always I've got skinny fingers, right? And I'm always amazed by dudes with like big meat hooks that can still play all of the little things.
I appreciate that. Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Red Bullcart.
No.
He's a country guitar player, and always make jokes about him being a leprechaun because he's a Canadian guy. I would describe him as heavy set, and he's redheaded, and he really does look like a leprechaun, but he's huge, right?
Right.
And he has these hands that each finger is like as big as my hand, and somehow or another, he's one of the best country guitar players, Western swing guitar players, jazz guitar players I've ever seen. And it's really taking that concept you just spoke of to a whole different level. When you watch him play it, you can't figure out how he's making all these jazz chords with these ham hands that he has.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned, the time frame you were getting into, recording, and I've read where you were a self-professed junk hound, and like when you think back on, when you started collecting gear, knowing that someday it would jump up in price, like any early scores where you're like, yeah, those were some good ones before everything took off online.
Well, the funny thing is, I never bought anything thinking that it would be worth a bunch of money in the future, and even now with the guitar prices the way they are and vintage recording equipment prices the way they are, I still can't believe that people are paying that kind of money for this stuff. But, when I got into it, you could buy 50s Fender Stratocasters for $600, and we thought that was really expensive. You know what I mean?
Right.
Just because you were making $50 a gig, like, wow, that's a really expensive guitar. And now when you see them selling for $50,000 or more, you're like, oh, so no players actually buy those anymore. It's
right.
Doctors and lawyers and investment bankers who like guitar. But I was always a junk hound, and back especially when I first moved to California, it was insane how much stuff there was here in Southern California that people were giving away, throwing away, selling for super cheap. I mean, it was just stupid, man. I would drag myself out of bed and go to garage sales every weekend, and just the amount of amazing stuff that people had, like you said, pre-internet and pre-eBay and all those kind of things.
Do you think it was the transition of like the digital age starting to come on with recording and people being like, well, I don't need this old analog gear anymore, so I'm going to dump it?
Yeah, it was that happened earlier. I talked to guys that were out here in Los Angeles in the 1980s when all the digital stuff first came in, and they talk about going around to the dumpsters outside the major recording studios here in Los Angeles, and they were throwing away these pieces of gear that are now worth, tens of thousands of dollars just because they were old tube pieces of gear. I missed out on that, but I did catch the last wave of stuff that was moderately priced before the internet came in, and, the internet is great for communal knowledge, right? I'm not objecting to that. But at the same time, it takes away the whole thing of back in the old days, you'd find something and some guy would look at this junky piece of gear laying on the ground and he'd think, well, that can't possibly be worth more than $10. Well, now, if you have a phone, you can look it up and say, oh, crap, somebody just sold one of those for $22,000. So it really has changed the game completely. But I was happy that I managed to score some really good stuff in those early days.
So I'm a Tascam 388 guy. It's what I do everything on right in my living room. And
Nice.
I had to have a friend show me the ropes on, how to use it and how to, I know it's just 1/4 inch tape, but there's still stuff to learn. And I read an
Right.
interview where you were talking about a radio show back in Missouri where some old timers would kind of show you the ropes on some of that analog gear. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, well, I actually had a radio show on a community radio station out there called KOPN, which is still going strong.
Cool.
And I was super young, but I was very energetic and enthusiastic. And so they were very kind. They let me have my own show where I played rockabilly music on Friday nights. And part of the deal with having a show on a community radio station is that you have to do volunteer work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fine with doing volunteer work. And part of that was you had to take these classes learning how to use stuff in the production room. And that was really where they taught me how to use tape recorders, which even at the time were sort of obsolete. That was really when they were using carts and these kind of things. I mean, it was pretty rare that anybody would actually play a reel-to-reel tape on the radio.
Right.
But it was great education and stuff that I still use every single day, just like how to thread a reel of tape, and how to clean the heads and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I didn't learn until the other day that you're also a writer and a good one. Like I didn't know that about you. And, Strat in the Attic is new to me and I'm excited to read both volumes. But I read some of your periodical work on Vintage Guitar Magazine and stuff like that. And you're a real writer and chronicler of very particular corners of rock and roll and, guitar history. I'm just wondering, like, how did you come into that? When did you curate it with all the years of actual touring and playing?
Well, I was I was studying journalism in college and that did not work out. But I always wanted to be a writer, and I guess certain things came naturally to me. Like I took a typing class in high school, and suddenly I could still type super fast. I'm not sure why that lesson stuck in high school, and so many other things have completely left my brain. But as this journey went on, I realized that there were certain stories that needed to be told, and so I really wanted to get into writing CD liner notes and writing magazine articles, and I started doing a little bit of that. And eventually, there's a company called Bear Family Records over in Germany that used to do a ton of reissue stuff and box sets and things like that, and they gave me a ton of work, and that's really sort of where I cut my teeth, was just writing all these liner notes and box set books for them. And I kind of taught myself how to do all the research and that sort of thing. And then I wound up writing for Guitar Player magazine for about 5 years, and did a bunch of articles for Vintage Guitar Magazine and the Fretboard Journal. And the book thing, I've written 3 books, and it's really neat to have the books on the shelf and say, I wrote that, but if you want to look at how much you made per hour of writing those books, you really don't want to think about that, because even though all 3 of my books were with legit publishers and they did pay me to write them, man, when I think about how many thousands of hours I put into each one, it's like, oh man, I must have made about a nickel an hour,
Yeah, right. And with Strat in the Attic, as I learn about what the concept is, the ultimate finds in your time as a junk hound, like when you come across something in God knows where, whose house or attic, and this thing has supreme value, and the person that may have let you in knows nothing about it, like how do you go about that process of like offering somebody, hey, I can take this off your hands, it's going to be worth $30,000, but I'm not trying to like rip you off. Like, how do you go about that sort of thing?
Well, that's an issue that a lot of people argue about.
Right.
And I always look at it like, okay, if I'm at an estate sale and some guy has this thing in his front lawn and it's got a price tag on it of $25, but it's actually worth $2,000.
Right.
Well, look, man, he put a price tag on it. I'm gonna pay his price, right?
Yep.
So I have no moral objection to if somebody doesn't do their own research and doesn't know what they have. If they put a price on it, I'm just going to pay that price. However, there's many cases like you talk about where you have to actually go in and like befriend these people, and there's been a bunch of cases like that where they had some kind of musical instrument that they really didn't know what to do with. And I was like, look, I would like to buy this instrument from you. Let's try to figure out a price. And so there's been a couple of cases where I just sent them to grooms or carters in Nashville just to get an appraisal. And then we just kind of worked out a price sort of, based on the condition or whatever. And there's been several cases where somebody had a musical instrument that was super weird and there's not really any way to know what it is worth.
Right.
And we just kind of either guessed at a price, or in several cases, somebody was like, look, man, my kids don't care anything about this stuff, and it's probably just going to go in the dumpster when I die. So I'm just going to give this to you.
Right. Totally.
And it's like, well, that's fantastic. Buddy Merrill, who was the guitar player on the Lawrence Welk show, he had all these prototype Fender guitars and things like that, and the collectors had come and gotten these prototype Fender guitars from him a long, long time ago. But when I met him, man, I just wanted to hang out and talk about his career and his music and his steel guitar playing and, how he knew Speedy West and Alvino Ray and all these kind of people. And then finally, it was like, wow, whatever happened to that Micro Frets guitar that you had? And he's like, well, I think I still have it. We're rooting around in his closet, and sure enough, there's the Micro Frets guitar, and he's just like, you just take it, man. You know about this stuff, and you like it. I want it to go somewhere where it's appreciated.
Right.
So,
right.
I love stories like that because it's like I probably was the only guy to sit there and just like bond with him about music in 20 years.
Yes. I mean, on that note, you've worked with and crossed paths, whether it's, performing or recording or writing about so many players, big and small. Like, is there anybody when you finally met them kind of like took your breath away? Like you turned into like a teenager almost, like, holy shit, this is that person.
Well, yeah, one guy that really did me that way when I first met him, but then I eventually wound up interviewing him, and he was just a super nice guy, was Al Schmidt, who was a famous recording engineer. Man, you can't even begin to list this guy's credits, but, he recorded Sam Cooke, he recorded Elvis, he recorded all these people, and he's really one of my idols. And I was loaning a bass to Marty Stewart's band, and they were recording at the Capitol Tower in Hollywood, and I had never been down there, and so I wanted to see the inside of the studio. And it turns out that Bob Dylan and his band were recording in the next studio over at Studio B. And we were kind of hanging out in the hallway talking to Bob Dylan's band. I didn't get to meet Bob. And all of a sudden, Al Schmidt walks by, and I was like, holy crap, that's Al Schmidt. He recorded Sam Cooke. He recorded the Astronaut Surf Band. He recorded this. He recorded that. And I was speechless. I couldn't even form a sentence, But then after that initial shock, I realized that I could probably make a few phone calls and figure out a way to interview him. And so that's exactly what I did. I wound up making another trip over there to the Capitol Tower and sat down and interviewed him for about 2 hours, which was great because, man, that guy just had so much history.
That's cool because, I mean, guys like that, I mean, they're probably not getting recognized on the street. And if you can give them, shine some, really intentional light on their careers, I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the sad thing is that I interviewed him and I got some really great stuff that he never really talked about anywhere else. But then he didn't even tell me when I interviewed him that he was working on a book. And so this book came out about 3 months after I interviewed him. I'm like, oh, crap. So the interview actually never got published, but I do still have that interview. I recorded it, and at some point it'll be definitely worth editing and putting out in a magazine article or something.
If there anybody living, player-wise that you'd love to connect with that you haven't, or maybe somebody you just missed before time won the ultimate battle, I mean, who do you think of in that regard?
Well, I've got to play with almost every single one of my heroes, but I never got to play with Chuck Berry. And, if I had played with Chuck Berry, it probably would have been a terrible experience because he was so mean to all of his bands. But I regret not being in Chuck's band at least once and having him yell at me or do something crazy or, start the song in the wrong key or something.
Right.
I really wish that I had had that opportunity. But, man, I really can't complain because all these people that I idolized, I wound up being friends with, like Scotty Moore that played with Elvis Presley and
right.
James Burton, who also played with Elvis Presley, and Ricky Nelson and a ton of different people. And I've just been really lucky in getting to know all the people that I have and play with them.
That's cool. I mean, and now you're one of those guys that people want to play with and talk about the past and all that. I mean, that's got to be kind of full circle flattering,
Yeah, although, I still, it's the curse of playing in a rock and roll band is that, you sort of stay at the same mental age that you were when you started.
Uh-huh.
So in my mind, I feel like I'm this young teenage dude, and then I realize, oh crap, man, I'm in my late 50s, and all these kids in their 20s think that I'm just a total old timer.
So where do the Whippersnappers fall in your pantheon of bands? I mean, what feels unique or noteworthy, excites you about the band in the context of your career?
Well, I've had a bunch of different bands over the years, and I had a band called the Echophonics, which was, it was never a solid lineup, but it was a lot of the same musicians that I would play with a lot. And my bass player wound up playing with Social Distortion. Another bass player that I had went on to play with this band Tiger Army. My drummer went on to play with Low Straitjackets. And this just kept happening. And a lot of the musicians, especially in my peer group of my own age, they would just wound up getting these gigs with other people. And it just kept happening over and over and over again. And it was starting to really tick me off. So I just had this idea, instead of trying to work around these guys' schedules who were so busy and stretched so thin playing with so many other bands, I wanted to play with some young, energetic guys that didn't have a whole bunch of stuff occupying their calendar.
Mm-hmm.
And I started searching around for the right guys. And the first lineup of the band was just 3 guys, no drums, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and upright bass. And these 2 guys, Bert Avalos and Xander Griffith, they're just, man, they're gems. They're young dudes. They play really well. They're super nice. And we just had a great time playing together. And we added a drummer, a guy named Dylan Patterson, back in 2022. And I love playing with him.
That's cool. I remember the first time I saw a format like that live in a bar, and it was Wayne the Train Hancock. And it kind of blew me away. I mean, you ever cross paths with a guy like Wayne the Train?
Yeah, well, I've played gigs with Wayne. I was never in his band or anything, but I've done probably 6 or 7 gigs with him and known him for years.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain majesty to the upright, just kind of carrying the rhythm, in a way that no other instrument of its ilk can.
Yes, and a lot of the first rockabilly bands had no drummer. The Scotty and Bill and bands like that, and they made a heck of a racket without any drummer and got along just fine. And I really enjoyed doing that style of rockabilly music. But eventually, if you're playing for bigger audiences and stuff, they really want to have that backbeat.
Yep.
So it made sense to add the drummer, and it's been a great lineup ever since then.
So, as a musical lifer with all of your endeavors and side hustles, what are you excited about right now? Like, whether it's a new piece of gear, a showcase you're working on, a session, what's got you going right now?
Well, it's funny you say that because I have been doing it a really long time, but at the same time, when you come up with a really good new song and, you make some really good new recordings, man, I get excited about it as when I was making my first album a long time ago. And myself and the Whippersnappers, we just did a recording session maybe about 3 weeks ago. This one song that we did, I wrote it. It's called Riding with the Devil, Going Fast as I Can Go. It just really turned out really well. And we wound up shooting a video for it, which should be out, I would guess, maybe in July sometime.
Cool.
And we hope to have vinyl and CD of that, those sessions out around the same time. And man, I'm excited about it. It's a really good song. Everything about it, the production, the recording, the video that we shot, everything is just really, really good. And that gets you going, man. It gets you excited.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know people are excited to have you in Chico. I like you said, I'm sure it's been ages. Do you even remember the last place you might have played here?
I don't, the funny thing is, I don't think I've ever played in Chico.
Oh, right. There you go.
I've been up to, from Los Angeles up to Portland and Seattle 100 times.
Uh-huh.
And I've played in Eureka and Redding and Ashland and Eugene and Medford and all those kind of places. But I don't think I've ever once stopped and played in Chico. And that's kind of odd because it is a college
It's a
town.
college
you
town.
would think that at some point I would have played there.
Right. No, I've got some folks that are really pumped. I'm going to be working. I work for Jonathan Richman. I do merchandise for him, and I'm going to be working.
Very cool.
Yeah. I mean, he's in his 70s and still going. I mean, so I'll be working these shows in the Northwest when you're in Chico, but I'm going to have you all set up. And I was so excited that you wanted to play here that I just wanted to book it anyway, even though I had to be gone.
Man, that's cool. You got the road gig with Jonathan. I have a really good Jonathan Richman story.
Oh, lay it on me.
Well, he used to come through and play in my hometown at a club called the Blue Note a lot.
Okay.
I mean, quite a bit. And, I saw him 2 or 3 times, and it seemed like he always kind of had a band.
Uh-huh.
At least a bass player and drummer. But he was coming into town, and he was playing this club, and it was just him and a drummer.
Uh-huh.
And the owner of the club said, he needs a Fender Super Reverb. Do you have one that you can loan me or rent me or whatever? And so, sure, I have a Fender Super Reverb, and Jonathan Richman is welcome to use it.
Right.
And so this was during a period of time where that sort of college rock was really popular, at least in Columbia, Missouri.
This would have been late 80s?
Yeah, late 80s, like, Soul Asylum and REM
Yep.
and all these kind of bands would play there, and they'd have 400 or 500 college kids going crazy. So Jonathan Richman had this huge crowd, and he shows up, and it's just him and a drummer.
Mm-hmm.
And he puts my Super Reverb all the way back against the far wall of the stage, like the very back of the stage, and he turns it up to 1. And he tells them, I don't want you to put a microphone on the amplifier.
Right.
And then he tells the guy, I don't want you to put any mics on the drums. And then he says, I want a Shure 57 to sing out of. And so it was just one microphone that was going through the PA system, right?
Yeah.
And the place is freaking packed.
Right.
And so he starts playing, and he will not get any closer than about 4 or 5 inches away from the vocal microphone. He's singing, but he's so far away that the sound guy can't really get any volume out of it, or else it'll just start, feeding back.
Yeah.
So basically, he's in front of about 400, beer drinking, very rowdy college students there, and it's the quietest show ever. And what's hilarious is that it totally turned into this sort of punk rock riot where people are yelling at Jonathan to turn up.
Right.
And they're getting really upset and yelling at him to turn up, and he just refused to do it. And I remember watching this. I'm like, wow, this is really unique. This is probably the most punk rock thing I've ever seen, and it's 60 decibels. It's so quiet you can't even hear the music. Anyway, that's my Jonathan Richman story.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'll let you get going, Deke, but it was a real pleasure to talk with you, man. And I'm looking forward to you playing here, and I'll see maybe if I can make it to one of your other gigs, but we'll be in contact before the show, and I'll make sure you're all set up proper.
Very cool. It's great to talk to you, man. Thank you for calling.
All right, brother. Talk to you in a bit. Bye.
Okay. Bye.